This presentation is to best support districts that are developing their local optional teacher designation system using stakeholder engagement strategies. The purpose of this presentation is to identify what are some best practices as districts are developing their systems. We're going to begin with our context, go into best practices and scenarios, and close with our gratitude. Our objectives for this training are for participants to understand and use best practices for the purpose of creating a well-developed, robust local optional teacher designation system. Participants are also going to be able to explain the why. Why does stakeholder engagement matter so much for our local optional teacher designation systems? Why do we want to get stakeholder impact? What is the purpose of us engaging stakeholders, and what's the outcome? These objectives are going to be cleared and laid out in our session together today. Now, before we begin, there are two really important vocabulary terms that we're needing to define to give us a clear understanding. The first is stakeholder engagement. Stakeholder engagement is a robust process of sharing information, gathering input, and creating investment in a project or decision. Our District System Development Committee, which is a best practice within stakeholder engagement, are a group of individuals that are tasked with designing a district's local optional teacher designation system. We're going to clearly define these terms even more as the presentation continues. I want us to take a moment and think about the primary and secondary stakeholders that we discussed earlier. Here, they are sectioned into 3 buckets to help us better understand. One of the stakeholders that I want to call out is under the District System Development Committee bucket. As I mentioned, the District System Development Committee is a group of stakeholders that gather to design a district's local optional teacher designation system. As you can see in the purple box on the far bottom left-hand corner, one of the stakeholders is having a key district leader with political influence. In order for your local optional teacher designation system to be effective, support from this leader is essential to tie in all of the components of the plan together and present it in a way that supports district goals and the overarching Teacher Incentive Allotment goals. Stakeholder engagement can be seen as a part of applying for the Teacher Incentive Allotment rather than a process that occurs throughout the entirety of the plan. For the first 1 to 2 years before the application process, stakeholder engagement is the primary component of TIA. In other words, the focus for the first 1 to 2 or more years will be on your stakeholder engagement plans, gathering your input, speaking to your necessary stakeholders, implementing what you hear from your stakeholders. That happens in the first 1 to 2 years. However, as this image indicates, stakeholder engagement is an ongoing process. You're engaging with your stakeholders, you're communicating with them, you're making sure that your stakeholder engagement process is happening throughout the entirety of your plan. In order to better understand stakeholder engagement, I like to think of it in 2 ways. This is the first way, stakeholder engagement as a cycle. As seen here, Information is a critical piece of the stakeholder engagement cycle. Not only is it the information that you are giving to stakeholders about the local optional teacher designation system, but it is also the information that you receive, which connects very nicely to input. What is the input that you're getting based on the information that you've given to districts? The input that you gather from your stakeholders is essential in creating a robust stakeholder engagement plan to support your local optional teacher designation system. The last part of the cycle is investment. If you have solid information and you're frequently getting input from your stakeholders, this is naturally going to build investment from your teachers, which is why we have stakeholder engagement. It is essential for us to be able to better understand that teachers are our primary stakeholders who we have to get investment from in order to have the strongest plan possible. This is another way for us to look at stakeholder engagement. First, we looked at it as a process or a cycle, and now we're looking at it more of an equation. For example, in giving information or communicating information, you have a district system development committee that can present an initial TIA interest PD to the whole staff. That is your district system development committee giving information to stakeholders. However, the data subcommittee of the district system development committee disaggregates the survey data to inform whether or not district participates in the Teacher Incentive Allotment program. That is you analyzing the input that was received from stakeholders in order to make a decision. When both of these things are done well, you will naturally build investment from teachers and all stakeholders who are going to be more engaged in this process because of the intentional moves made with your information and input. The rationale for stakeholder engagement is very clear. It's outlined in the 3 main goals of the Teacher Incentive Allotment Program. The first is to increase the recruitment of highly effective teachers in high needs districts. The second is to increase the retention of highly effective teachers in high needs districts. And the third is to increase equitable access and distribution of highly effective teachers in high needs districts for students with the greatest need. Naturally, when these 3 goals of TIA are done well, implemented, and kept in mind throughout the duration of a plan, teacher morale and support for the plan improves across the district, which allows us to better support students across the state of Texas. As districts engage in building a teacher incentive allotment plan, and more specifically your stakeholder engagement plan within it, there are some common stakeholder pitfalls. Not giving all teachers the opportunity or time to give input is something that can happen when building your stakeholder engagement plan. It is important for all teachers to have an opportunity to give input because it will build investment from all teachers. Now, not every teacher is going to be able to be a part of a focus group, for example. However, if you have different mechanisms in place throughout the duration of your plan, you can gauge the interest level, the understanding, and the support of the teachers that are in your district. One of the biggest pitfalls that we've noticed is including all stakeholder engagement elements at one time. Districts have a lot on their plate, and we want to best support everyone to have quality stakeholder engagement plans in support of their local optional teacher designation system. However, if we pile on too much at once, we're not going to get the quality and clarity at the end. One of the ways that we can address including too much stakeholder engagement at one time is by having a sample scope and sequence that details who the stakeholders are, when stakeholders should receive certain information, what the topics or information should contain, and what would the support look like over a long period of time. So we get big picture with the entirety of the plan, but we also get granular to be able to understand what stakeholder groups get what information and when. This is an example of a stakeholder engagement scope and sequence. On the scope and sequence, you can see that there are 5 categories: components of TIA, stakeholder engagement tool used, a topic to discuss, stakeholders that are included, and by when. Since this is an example, you'll notice in the when column that the description reads varies by stakeholders. That's because in a scope and sequence document, there will be specific timestamps for each stakeholder group. Teachers, for example, may have a training that is called "Why is Accurate Teacher Evaluation Important and What are the Benefits of This?" It is important that in the development phase of a scope and sequence that we understand what must come first, what must come next, last, so on and so forth. This stakeholder scope and sequence sample allows us to identify potential topics and stakeholders that would need information on those topics. In an upcoming training, you'll have an opportunity to work through some sample stakeholder engagement scope and sequence plans and be able to adapt for district context. As we begin our best practice section, I want to let us know what the 4 key best practices are for stakeholder engagement. The first is building a district system development committee. The second is information sharing. The third is input gathering. And the fourth is using the input. The first best practice for stakeholder engagement that we will discuss together is building a district system development committee. There are 4 key practices within the best practice of building a district system development committee. As mentioned before, the district system development committee is a group of stakeholders that are responsible for developing your local optional teacher designation system. The 4 key points within this best practice are that there should be an application that is accessible to staff members with varying levels of teacher effectiveness. The District System Development Committee should also have subcommittees. There should be at least 1 TIA ambassador per eligible campus that serves on the District System Development Committee, and that an application for the District System Development Committee is accessible to all stakeholders. We are now going to use the 4 key points that we just noticed in order to determine whether or not NET's ISD's District System Development Committee is effective. As a reminder, we're looking for, does the District System Development Committee have subcommittees where teachers can select with rationale? Is there at least one TIA ambassador per eligible campus? Are there teachers with varying levels of effectiveness and various years in the district? And is there a good mix of appointed and applied members of the District System Development Committee? As a takeaway, there's no magic combination. There's not an exact number of veteran teachers versus new teachers on the committee. However, the note here and what we want to stamp is that it just needs to be intentional. We need to have certain parts that are required. However, we want the System Development Committee to be intentional and to have the greatest impact. Now let's look at this table that the superintendent of NET's ISD created. The highlighted portions of the table are what is effective about the NET's ISD District System Development Committee. As you can see, Kyrie Irving is the 3rd grade math teacher and the TIA lead. The 3rd grade math teacher is highlighted because it is effective to have a teacher on your District System Development Committee. In fact, it's effective to have multiple teachers. Although NET's ISD does not have multiple teachers on their District System Development Committee, there is one who has 10 years in the district and picked a subcommittee that connects to their skill set. Now, if we look at the other highlighted sections, for example, campus, we know that there are 3 campuses on NET's ISD's District System Development Committee. That's because there are 3 campuses in the district. The campuses are Barclays, Atlantic, and Fulton. There is at least one representative from each eligible campus, which makes that an effective part of NET's ISD District System Development Committee. Now, if we move over to the appointed or applied column, notice that almost every single member of the NET's District System Development Committee was appointed by someone. That means that there is not a good mixture of appointed members and members who applied, which means that it is not highlighted, thus ineffective. The idea here is that the District System Development Committee needs to include a wide range of stakeholders. As you can see, there are some effective components of NET's ISD District System Development Committee. However, there could be some work done to make this even more effective. For example, having more members who applied and were approved, and having teachers at varying levels of effectiveness based on their T-test ratings. The next best practice is information sharing. There are 4 key practices within information sharing. The first is that it must start out as a presentation rather than inquiry-based exploration. We don't just want to send teachers off to explore a website. We want to make sure that there's a presentation that introduces our districts to TIA and to all of its many components. The next key point is that there are multiple resources shared openly with all stakeholders. It's important to have a website that they can access. It's important to have many resources that teachers can access. The next key point is specific information is targeted towards specific groups. That means that if you are, for example, an art teacher, the sessions that you attend based on stakeholder engagement might be about creating an effective SLO for your art class. So the information shared with that art teacher would be specific to their content. And the last key point is that check for understandings should be differentiated with follow-up support provided. Whenever you're sharing information, you want to make sure that the recipients of the information are clear and that they understand and can have support when they do not understand. On to some practice. Timberwolves ISD has an information sharing PD that they're giving to their staff members. But first, before the PD, they required that teachers went on to www.tiatexas.org to browse information that's on the website in grade level teams. This was their first introduction to the Teacher Incentive Allotment program at their district. Teachers of tested subjects watch the video that you see on the left, and teachers of non-tested subjects watch the video that you see on the right. Using our 4 key points of information sharing, we're going to determine what was effective and what was ineffective. What was effective is that there was specific information that was targeted to specific groups. For example, your teachers of tested subjects were watching a video about validity of assessments. That is a specific group and specific information that was given to them to help them be effective. What was ineffective is that Timberwolves ISD did not first present the information to teachers. However, they sent them to the website in order to explore. Although information sharing is a critical best practice, it builds to another really important best practice, which is taking the information that you shared in order to gather input. One of the ways that you can gather input from your stakeholders is by having focus groups. As you see here, focus groups are laid out in steps. Preparing to analyze your focus group information and data, getting to know the data, categorizing the data, identifying patterns, themes, and connections, and synthesizing and reporting on your findings. And all of these steps within focus groups are based on evidence that you gathered. As we're gathering input, the 4 key points are listed here on the screen. We're going to use these key points in order to determine if the focus group analysis for a sample district was effective. The sample district that we're going to be assessing is Cavaliers Technology School. So Cavaliers Technology School decided to have focus groups asking an essential question. The essential question was, do you think SLOs are a valid and reliable way for Cavaliers Technology Schools to measure student growth? Cavaliers Technology Schools asked 50 out of their 500 teachers, which is a part of the best practice because it is a representative sample size. It would not be effective if Cavaliers ISD asked 5 teachers across their district, but it is a representative sample size because they asked 50 out of the 500 teachers. There was also a very clear, specific question, which does reflect the best practice. However, notice the trend and the evidence. The trend reads, middle school teachers do not understand how SLOs are used to measure student growth. However, the evidence reads that 83% of elementary teachers stated that they are not ready to use SLOs due to a lack of training. This was data that Cavaliers Technology Schools collected from their focus groups. However, the trend and the evidence do not match. If you take a close look, you can see that the trend is referring to middle school teachers, whereas the evidence is referring to elementary school teachers. An adjustment that can be made is to match your trend and your evidence to be sure that your focus group data is effective. The last best practice we'll note together is using the input that you gathered. Analyzing the input data, sharing the trends, being transparent about why the input was not used, if it wasn't used, and sharing changes that were made based on the input are all key points of using the input as a best practice. We're going to use these key points to determine if Maverick's Montessori Charter School used input successfully. The question that we're going to ask ourselves is, what recommendations would you provide Maverick's Montessori schools based on the data you see in the graph? Now let's take a moment to analyze the data. We see that elementary school teachers believe that teachers should not be observed, right? Most of the elementary school teachers in Maverick's Montessori schools, 262 to be exact, believe that teachers should not be observed. In middle school, however, middle school teachers believe that one observation does not show the breadth of their teacher skills. High school teachers happen to agree with middle school teachers. 207 high school teachers believe that one observation does not show the breadth of their teacher skills. These survey results helps us to better understand the question, do you think one 45-minute observation per year is enough time to determine teacher effectiveness? Now, as we're looking at this data, we have to determine what are some recommendations that we would make. So, as we can see, middle school and high school teachers pretty much have similar survey data. However, elementary school teachers have a different thought. As you can see in the circle, these are some recommendations that we would provide to Maverick's Montessori schools using the input data. First, we would recommend that Maverick's increase teacher observations to 3 for middle and high school teachers based on the stakeholder data. 1 could be announced, short, scored. 1 could be unannounced, short, scored. And 1 can be a long scored observation. Another recommendation could be coaching and feedback is shared with teachers after each observation. And the last recommendation could be that there's a separate meeting with elementary teachers to determine the root cause. Why elementary teachers are sort of torn. Together, we have discussed the 4 best practices for stakeholder engagement. The first is building a district system development committee. The second was information sharing. The third was input gathering. And the fourth is using the input. Together, we're going to bring all of it into the center, and we're going to analyze a sample stakeholder engagement plan using all of the key points of each best practice. As we put it all together, let's consider these 2 questions. What is strong about the district stakeholder engagement plan? And what feedback would we provide to make the plan even stronger? Celtics Public Schools participated in the Teacher Incentive Allotment program. Celtics Public Schools has a local optional teacher designation system that they are using. As you can see on the screen, Celtics Public Schools has a stakeholder engagement plan, and we're going to assess the readiness of the plan. The highlighted parts of the plan indicates what is effective. As you can see, the data capture year for Celtics Public Schools is 2020 to 2021. However, the stakeholder engagements began in 2020 to 2021. That is not enough time to build an effective stakeholder engagement plan for their local optional teacher designation system. Therefore, both of those parts are not highlighted because it signals that it is ineffective. As we've seen, it is important to note that effective stakeholder engagement happens at least 1 to 2 years before applying. Celtics Public Schools is a small district. However, what was effective is that members of the District System Development Committee applied to be on the committee, and they put their subcommittees with rationale. Another effective element of the stakeholder engagement plan is that there were many different stakeholder engagement tools that were used. For example, Celtics Public Schools used focus groups, surveys, PDs, and office hours as a way to develop an effective stakeholder engagement plan. As you determine the effective elements of Celtics Public Schools stakeholder engagement plan, we see that they've utilized many of the components that we've discussed in this training. In your own time, take a moment to consider what would make Celtics Public Schools stakeholder engagement plan even stronger. There are so many strong elements, but I know that together we can determine ways for Celtics Public Schools to improve their current plan. In closing, this is an example of a stakeholder engagement timeline. As mentioned, the next stakeholder engagement PD that you will have access to is a scope and sequence that allows districts to chunk key information of the Teacher Incentive Allotment program and who should receive that information, putting it on a timeline. This is an example of Jazz ISD's timeline. As you can see, at the beginning, Jazz ISD starts out with a TIA interest PD. This is a presentation to gauge interest in the Teacher Incentive Allotment program within their district. And in closing, if you look all the way on the other side to May, teachers provide feedback in focus groups. So we start with a whole group interest PD, and we end with teachers providing feedback. This helps us to understand the magnitude of teacher involvement. In order for your stakeholder engagement plans to be effective, building teacher investment is a key component. Thank you for watching and listening to this presentation. If you have any questions, feel free to visit www.tiatexas.org or email us at tia@tea.texas.gov. Thank you for your time.